for this too kind introduction, really. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for coming. What I would like to present today is how the European Union is preparing itself to deliver financially on its international and domestic environment commitments. Internationally, that represents, of course, the Paris Agreement, but also the SDGs, for example, because Australia is also parties to these agreements. I think it could be of interest to you to hear, for you to hear how we are preparing ourselves. Before I dive into the subject, I'd like to present a little bit the atmospherics of the financial discussion in the European Union at the moment. Every 7 years, the 28, soon 27 member states that make up the European Union have to decide on our next 7-year budget for the EU institutions. And this discussion is starting now. And of course, the discussion is always very difficult, but now with the UK leaving us, it means one of the net contributors to the budget is leaving us. And the discussion is even more difficult than usual. But some people think that we should do less. Others think that just Germany and other wealthy countries within the EU should chip in more. Everybody agrees we should do smarter. If you use the money a lot better. And so, of course, our finance ministries have had a look at all the things that we had committed ourselves to, and I'm starting to be a little bit nervous about how we were going to deliver on all of that. The second atmospheric background is, of course, the UK leaving us, and the fact that it's actually opening a new opportunity for us financially. Because the City of London and the UK government were not exactly enthusiastic about further European integration of capital markets regulation. This is something the other member states were keen to do, and this is something that we are now going to be able to do, if possible, with a way to leverage more sustainable finance out of these rules, these new rules. Actually, it was a good time for us to do this revision of our financial regulatory framework, because in the aftermath of the banking crisis and the financial crisis, we'd done quite a lot of hurried regulatory work, but that was aimed mostly at short-term stabilization, not aimed at long-term impact. So it's time for us now to have a close look at the framework, the regulatory framework we've set around financial activities in the EU, so that we can really rethink it in a new positive way. And so we've had recently a look at whether we had the means of our vision in the EU. First of all, I'd like to present what our vision is. So we got all our 28 governments to agree to that. You'll see it's a bit of a mouthful, but no one can really disagree, which is the point. We want to transition to a low carbon, resource efficient, and increasingly circular economy characterized by high employment, technological innovation, and sustainable growth. Now this gets everyone around the table happy to work together, but doesn't really help our finance ministries to put a figure as to what this is. So I'll present you our targets, because that is a better indication of what we want to do. We've got all sorts of environmental targets, but these are the ones that are pertinent to climate and energy. So for 2020, that's the top line. These are our targets in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It's reducing our emissions by 20%. The baseline is 1990. For renewable energies to reach 20% of our total energy use, I must underline that it is not the same metric as the Australian renewable energy target, because the Australian rate is based on the share of the power sector. Ours is total energy use, so that includes transport fuels, heating fuels. It's a very different metric. This metric, translated into your Australian metric, compares to around 36, 37% of what your RET would be. And then we have an energy efficiency target, which is energy saving compared to business as usual by 2020, of reducing our consumption by 20%. We have an interconnection target, which is an energy security type of metric, which says that every member state has to be able to source its energy needs, 10% of its energy needs from outside its borders. So it's linked to interconnections, especially for electricity and gas pipelines. For 2030, our targets are to reduce emissions by 40%, still on the 1990 baseline. And these two targets are in red because we have not yet agreed to them. The legislation is not, we're still discussing, but it's going in the right direction, because the European Commission, the institution that proposed, that tables the law, had, for these two targets, proposed 27%. And now our member states and our parliaments are discussing within these brackets, so higher than what we had proposed, both for renewable share and for energy efficiency. So it really is going in the right direction. So how do these targets, translate into financial requirements? That's the type of figures that our financial minds have come up with, and they can really get many a finance minister nervous. These are yearly required investments to make sure that we maintain our current trajectory, meaning the 2020 type of targets in the climate sector is close to 1 trillion billion euros investments a year. To heighten up to 2030 targets, an extra 180 billion a year. And you can see what it means for other environmental commitments that we made either nationally or internationally. We haven't yet put a figure on the SDGs, but we are busy doing that. And so basically this is not within the capacities of the public purse in the EU, be it the small EU budget or the member states' own national budget. It really means that we are going to have to both use public finance in a smart way and have recourse to private finance and capital markets. The good news is that these figures are really within the vast capacity of European financial markets. Institutional investors and asset managers in the EU manage around 35 trillion euros. And the total size of the EU's financial market, capital markets, is about 100 trillion euro, 6 times the EU's GDP. So we should be able to do it. We just need to shift these flows towards in the right direction. So how can we do that? That's the question which we asked a high-level group on sustainable finance, which we appointed in January last year. We asked them to advise us on how to re-engineer all our regulation and our system to make sure we can deliver this finance. They came up with an interim report in July. We launched a public consultation on the interim report, and they issued a final report in January. And that's what I'm going to present now, basically. I present the findings of the high-level group. I present what they think we have done right so far, because we have not really done everything wrong. I present their recommendations and what we plan to do about their recommendations. So the findings are, it's a powerful critique, actually, that the group does of why finance has failed sustainability so far. The first critique you know all about, it's in Australia. It's about weak or inconsistent policy signals, or a weak carbon price or no carbon price, policy reversals. That doesn't help the private sector feel certain and feel confident about investing. Big first issue. Second issue is what is called the tragedy of the horizon. Background to the horizon is that if you want to build a new sustainable infrastructure, a new sustainable activity, it's actually quite intensive in capital, because what you're doing is that you're replacing resources with know-how and technology. You need to invest in a long-term, long-lasting asset with energy-efficient lighting, clean energy technologies, productive soil, good waste management. And that means that you're replacing the throughputs of materials and energy with this big capital investment that will have long return. So you need long-term horizon to do sustainability investments. The problem is that in Europe at the moment, capital markets are really working toward the short term. People are trying to extract the value at the very short term in whatever they do. For example, equity managers in the European Union keep an equity for an average of 8 months. It used to be 8 years, 28 years ago. And the average equity manager keeps turnover his or her entire portfolio within 20 months. So we really have a problem here, and we need to rethink the incentives and what goes wrong in the financial sector with regard to long-term vision. There's weak risk assessment and management. I mean sustainability risk assessment and management, in the sense that on boards and directors of the company do not necessarily know how to assess risks related to climate change. And that leads to suboptimal investment decisions in fossil fuel activities that could become stranded in a shorter term rather than the long term, or in assets that can't withstand the effects of climate change. Then there's an incomplete sustainability toolkit, meaning that we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about sustainable finance. We don't have the common metrics, we don't have the common methods. There's not enough certainty into what sustainable finance is, and that opens the door to greenwashing. And finally, there's a low level of sustainability literacy, both in the financial sector and in the users of the financial sector, meaning you and me. Come back to that. Come back to this one, because there's an interesting comment that the high-level group does. One of the key comments that high-level group has is that this actually isn't really a question that is solely for the financial sector's actors. It is a question for the whole of society. European household savings, for example, represent 40% of the EU's capital market. You add the pensions to that, it's 50% of the money. So the question really is where we want our savings, our pension money, our insurance money, what we want that money to fuel and finance in terms of activities and infrastructures. And that requires a collective discussion as to what matters to us collectively. And what matters to us Europeans, we have an idea thanks to the public consultation that we held last year. And by the way, if the financial sector worked in the way that people wanted to, that could really help the financial sector reclaim the positive role that it can play in society. But that's what the group highlights, and I must say I agree. So what the domestic consultation, public consultation showed is that Europeans want the financial system to consider the full value of assets, to be productive rather than speculative, to be resilient to shocks, including climate shocks, to demonstrate alignment with its users' preferences. That's what I was talking about. What you want your savings to work towards, what you want your pensions to work towards, so that there is this alignment between what people want and what their money is contributing to bring about. And then the financial sector could take a long-term perspective. So now, what has the EU done so far? The group recognizes that we haven't done everything wrong. We first tried to support consistent policy signal, tried to use financial public money smartly, and we've done a few attempts at early financial sector reform. This map is actually characteristic of one of the problems that we have with policy signals in Europe. It dates from 2014, but it is the cost of capital to finance a renewable project in Europe. And you can see how different it is depending on what country you're thinking of making your investment. And that is a problem because our finance people have told us that if everyone could use the same interesting capital costs as there was in Germany, we could save 30 billion euros on our targets each year. And so we are really interested in this strong policy signal throughout the EU so that we can make sure that everyone gets the same terms for investments. So what have we done recently to strengthen the policy signal? First, we revised our ETS legislation. That's the emissions trading schemes that sets a cap on pollution from industry and the power sector, in particular also aviation, but let's focus on industry and the power sector. What we've done is that we have changed the slope of the cap on pollution to make sure that we reach our 2030 target, and that will probably increase the carbon price in the European Union. Observers are saying they expect a 20 euro price in 2020 and a 30 euro price in 2030. So that changes the outlook of investors, and that gives a strong policy signal. The good thing about the ETS is that it's very robust legislation. Even if we don't modify it at the end of each period, the decreasing factor, the slope is continuously going down. So there is a never-ending outlook that it's going to be, the stringency will be strengthened. We've also recently asked all our member states to prepare decadal 10-year plans for their climate and energy policies. That's for us to be able to actually answer to the Paris Agreement requirements of increasing our target every 5 years. To do that, we need all our member states to have a plan for what they want to do over 10 years on climate and energy. And so we've set a new, it's called the governance regulation, where we're asking each of our 28, 27 member states to tell us what kind of renewable target they would aim at, by what time, what kind of energy efficiency target they would aim at, what would be their support schemes. So we're forcing a domestic political discussion with a 10-year framework on energy and climate in all of our member state countries. And that will increase as well the certainty for investors. We hope that it will force a bipartisan discussion everywhere. That is already the case in many countries, but not all of them. And that the mechanics of that hopefully will make this happen. The third thing that we've done recently is that we've reviewed our renewables legislation so that the support schemes that are put up by member states have a 3-year rolling certainty. So no more retroactive changes and no changes with too short notice. We will be able to EU rules to prevent that, and that will give people also more certainty as to what's their investment, what are the parameters of their investment. What we are also thinking about doing is designing a new financial instrument whereby a member state and the European institutions would agree, who sets the terms of support for renewable investment in that particular country. And the EU would actually guarantee, would underwrite that level of support in that member state, and any repayments would be then by the EU would be repaid by the corresponding member state. The idea is that we spread out the lowest capital costs that exist in the EU to all other EU countries. And finally, we have tried to be smart with public finance. So this is a list of what we're trying to do. I'll try to be quick. I can't talk about everything, but you can ask questions. First of all, we have a mainstreaming target in the EU budget. Rather than have a big climate department with a big budget, we haven't done that. We have a small climate department with a very small budget. But we've said that all other departments have to have a minimum climate relevant spending target to reach. For the research department, it's 35%. 35% of what any fund they give has to be climate relevant. Each department has a different target. Overall, has to be 20% mainstreaming within the EU budget. And that really forces the idea that climate change is the business of any portfolio and not of the commissioner, the minister for climate. Second thing that we've done is that we've set up the European Investment Bank. That's the EIB, is the world's largest multilateral bank. And we help the EIB giving concessional loans, interesting loans, by using a guaranteeing them with the EU budget. And we have what we call the European Fund for Strategic Investments, which has been very successful so far. It's had a target of leveraging 350 billion between 2015 and 2017, and it actually leveraged between 2015 and 2020. We've already had 250 billion leveraged through that fund, but we're not too happy with the level of mainstreaming of climate relevant projects within that fund. It's only around a third, and we want to put it up to 40% and increase the leverage target to $500 billion by the end of the decade. And we're putting more money in terms of capacity building for the pipeline of projects and helping people to structure their project financially to attract the private sector within that fund that gives interesting loans to people that have projects that are considered strategic for the European Union to achieve its objectives, including the environmental objectives. We're also using the revenues from the ETS in an interesting way. It's a bit like Arena does. We are co-financing investments in the renewable sector. That's what we were doing with what was called the NER 300 fund. That's new entrant reserve 300 million allowances. We set aside some allowances. We monetize them for the EIB. With the money, we co-fund some investments in the EU. So far, it was only for renewables. And now in post-2020, we're also going to co-fund, well, it used to be also CCS, but we never could do a CCS project because there was no co-financing to match our financing. It was a financial crisis. CCS projects are very expensive, but we are still trying to do CCS co-financing and CCSU co-financing, and we're also extending it to clean energy, clean industrial technologies such as clean cement, clean pulp and paper, clean steel, all these demonstration of technologies that could make these industries become cleaner. We also have the Modernization Fund, which is to help countries basically in Eastern Europe modernize their energy system. These funds, if all goes well with the carbon price, could mobilize up to 18 billion euros over 2020-2030 for this co-financing of new projects. And then we've made a series of announcements at Macron's One Planet Summit in December. I'll talk about two of them. The Orbis program, as the name suggests, is dedicated to cities. The idea is that cities throughout Europe can access free advice for financially preparing their projects to attract private capital, as long as their projects are climate or sustainability related. So we're setting aside, it's 5 million a year to create this advisory service for cities in Europe. Similarly, the Smart Finance for Smart Building financial program is a program whereby we're guaranteeing energy efficiency investments in buildings, and we're setting up with 14 million euros a year, advisory local office throughout the European Union, where public bodies there or even households can come and have advice on how to structure their loans, and we will help with guaranteeing with the EU budget. We have a strong challenge with buildings because they are responsible for about 40% of our emissions, and the refurbishing rate is about 1% a year of our stock. It's not enough, we need to go to 2%. We believe that with this program, the Smart Finance or Smart Buildings program, we can leverage 10 billion by 2020, create 220,000 jobs in building retrofitting, and take 3.2 million people out of energy poverty. So that really attracted a lot of positive interest from all member states, because that's what we actually need now in the European Union, local jobs doing that type of investments. So that's our attempts at revising financial regulation. What I've done is that I highlighted in red the limitations of what we've done so far. There's no limitation for the first bullet, because I think we've done what we should, and that's complete, in that we've allowed investments in energy efficiency by public bodies, especially energy performance contracts, to be done off balance sheet. Some public institutions were not ready to do that. They were worried that it would weigh on their deficit or debt levels, and there's no problem for that to be done off balance sheet. So we changed our accounting rules to make that possible. Then something which we've done recently, we revised our non-financial reporting directive to require that 600 large listed companies assess and disclose sustainability risks. This is limited, it's only 6,000 companies throughout Europe. We need to go further than that. We've also revised one of our pension regulation to require that some pension funds, not all of them, we've got different types of pension funds, different types of regulation, but one piece of legislation was recently revised so that they have to include environmental and social factors in their risk management system. That's piecemeal, but it's a start. We've done the same for other types of pension funds and insurance companies, so that this time it was about disclosing their engagement policy for environment. We've also lowered capital requirements for insurance companies for certain infrastructure projects. We believe that's not enough. For example, we would like to lower capital requirements for banks when they're doing loans such as energy efficiency in buildings or electric vehicles. We believe there is a link between lower rate of default of payments, and so there shouldn't need to be such high capital requirements for banks doing that. Then we require that retail investors, as you and me, be informed about the environmental and social objectives of investment products. So when you go to your bank, basically that requires that you're given a brochure, not a lot more than that. It's very passive, and we really want to do more than you being given a brochure. We would like you to be asked about what your preferences are, and that the brochure that you're given actually is devoid of any greenwashing. So it is really not enough, but it's a start. So what does the group recommend? Two types of recommendations. One is about providing trust in these green financial products, and the second is really about mobilizing more money towards sustainable finance, sustainable development. First aim, providing trust. We believe we could achieve a lot if we started by having a taxonomy. A taxonomy meaning that we decide on a set of criteria or conditions that need to be met before an investment can be called sustainable or can be considered to achieve the EU's environmental objective. The idea is to fight greenwashing. The idea is also to transform any country's energy or climate transition plan into a capital raising plan. We would also like to create standards and labels, in particular a label for what you can call a green fund. The activities, the specifications would be that the activities are all of them are compatible with the taxonomy, so they're good enough from the sustainable point of view, that there's no incompatible business within that fund, so basically no fossil fuel activities or other types of polluting activities, and that there is strong environmental impact criteria for the fund. We would also want to develop a standard for a green bond, a European standard for green bond, whereby a listed bond could be called a green bond, a European green bond, if its proceeds were 100% invested in activities compatible with the taxonomy, where the issuance documentation mentioned the alignment with the European Green Bond Standard, and that alignment is verified by accredited independent review experts. That's really the key, because at the moment, it's really self-assessed rather than anything else, and we want a review system to make sure that there's no greenwashing there. Finally, we want to improve citizens, retail investors' access to information on sustainability performance. I was mentioning the brochure you're going to be given. So that is to make sure that the language in the brochure is using the taxonomy, that everything is verified, there's no greenwashing there. Is to make sure that you are asked your preferences about sustainability for your investment, and that you're also given information as to how you can exercise your voting rights. That's an example, that's the frame of the taxonomy and all the work we have to do. So it tells you, on the top you see the goals, so climate change mitigation, adaptation, healthy natural habitats, waste minimization, that's all the environmental goals that we've subscribed to. Here you have the real economy activities, so waste management, buildings, urban development, transport, and we need to fill the squares, each little box, with the list of conditions and criteria for that activity to be compatible with that goal. So it's a huge job that's going to be done by the European Investment Bank with the help of an advisory group. Now, we also want to mobilize more finance. And one key thing we want to do is to revise all the legislation that we have regarding financial sector actors to make sure that we clarify that investor duties include sustainable risk management, and also force them to adapt their time horizon to that of the people they serve, and that the people they serve give informed consent on sustainability issues. So I'll explain. The idea is that you go to your bank. Not only are you asked about your sustainability preferences, but you also ask about your time horizon. How long will you keep that money in that pot? Is it 20 years? Is it 5 years? It's not at all the same type of investment. And that's your investment advisor has to take into account your requirements when he does his risk investment strategy, his assets allocation, and his reporting. It is to make sure that pension funds and insurance companies, they don't manage all the investment themselves. They hire asset managers to do that. And the asset managers, unfortunately, they don't recognize necessarily that the pension funds and the insurance company typically have a long-term horizon because they don't need to realize investments very early. But the asset managers, they are usually assessed on very short-term criteria. And so they don't translate their clients' requirements or needs into the way they invest the money of their clients, in particular pension funds and insurances. And we want to change that mismatch of time horizon between the beneficiaries or the members, the clients, and the way their money is handled. We also want to upgrade Europe's disclosure rules. So there's at the moment globally 2 main experiences with disclosure of sustainability climate risks. There is the G20 Financial Stability Board Task Force on Financial Disclosure, non-financial disclosure. And that's basically a voluntary scheme whereby around 230 companies have said they would use the FSBT CFSB's recommendation with carbon risk disclosure. And there is France has passed an energy transition law, whose Article 173 is requiring all listed companies and financial institutions to assess, report, and act on the risks that they find regarding sustainability and to develop an sustainability strategy. So the French law only entered into force last year. It's very early on, and we want to learn from the experience of both the companies that are doing voluntary, the Bloomberg scheme, the TCFD's recommendation, and the French law before we set up our own compulsory European disclosure scheme. But we want that scheme to be up and running in 2020. So in the next 2 years, we are going to assess and review and consult, and then propose a disclosure framework for all actors in time to kick in 2020. Then we want to strengthen director duties and stewardship principle. This is about people that sit on boards. Boards are sometimes a hindrance to taking a holistic view of risk. That's because these people are not necessarily trained into what climate change is or able to assess climate risks. And we want to change what we call the fit and proper tests. So on the boards of financial institutions, people that are nominated there have to pass a fit and proper test that is run by the supervisory financial institutions. And we want to make sure that the fit and proper tests now include the capacity of these board members to understand climate risks, to understand the wider shareholder context, and to understand how to take into account clients' preference in the investment strategy of the institution. We also want to include minimum stewardship principle into investment mandates. This is to make sure that the people you mandate to take care of your money, your investments, they are not remunerated according to short-term principles of extracting value in the short term, that they themselves develop stewardship principles covering sustainability, and that they engage with the investee company with a view to building long-term value. So that would be a new minimum regulation regulating asset management in the EU. And we want to also update the mandate of the supervisory institutions to financial sectors to make sure that they include sustainability within all what they supervise, basically. So what are we going to do about all of that? The report has had a very warm welcome. Actually, we were ourselves, the European institution, were on the high-level group panel, so we were part of the discussions. And in the Macron summit in December, the two vice presidents of the commission in charge were not able to refrain from saying we are going to implement most of what the recommendations are actually proposing. So it's really kind of a done deal, even though we're only expecting the action plan to be published in March. They've already, so the heads of the European Commission have already said we want to do the taxonomy work, the big table that you saw. We want to develop that by 2020, starting with mitigation and then going to deciding on the criteria for all sorts of other goals. We want to have an EU green bond standard. We want to have the disclosure rules and investor duty rules. We want to lower capital requirements for e-vehicle loans and energy efficiency mortgages. We want the supervisory authorities to have a new mandate so that they make sure that sustainability is a question for all the financial sector actors. I haven't mentioned the credit rating agencies and the benchmarks, but credit rating agencies are supervised by the supervisory authorities, and there's a lot that can be done to make sure the credit rating agencies are including sustainability within their ratings in a better way. And then we are going to do international advocacy work. So that's what I'm doing here. The idea, of course, is that if we develop a strong domestic framework for delivering sustainable finance, we can influence the G7, the G20, international setting bodies, other countries at large to actually also change their regulatory framework and help deliver sustainable finance at scale across the world to help us meet the Paris Agreement goals and the SDGs. So maybe as a conclusion, I can say that the goal of this exercise is basically to make sure that sustainable finance is no longer a sideshow. It's more of a method through which our financial system becomes more resilient, through which our companies have access to better price and more patient finance, and through which European citizens can have their values expressed in their financial choices. Of course, this is not enough to deliver a well below 2 degree, let alone a 1.5 degree world, but as a mirror of the value that we place on assets that trade freely within our open and democratic markets, it's one of the important things that we have to do to change the very many ways in which our economy is not working in a sustainable way. We also believe it's an opportunity. In the European Union, we have 8 million people employed in green jobs. And that shift towards a resource efficient, a circular economy, a low carbon economy, we believe it's the same scale as digitalization, except of course that the stakes for the planet and humanity are much higher. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. For those who are maybe coming late, this was not a presentation about Australian policies, it was about the EU. But maybe I start off with the first question. Australia is often a fascinating laboratory of climate, energy, also finance policies, because policies have a shorter shelf lifetime, but they are also coming and going. Where are examples of Australian policies or Australian policy experiments from which the EU could learn?
We are actually quite interested at the moment. I mentioned we are discussing our next 7-year budget, and there's a big pressure on agricultural funding to decrease and agricultural funding to be made more climate smart. And we believe Australia may have, I'm not sure if it's true yet, may have developed interesting agricultural methods to make, in particular, cattle farming greener through the emissions reduction fund. And so we are looking at the methods that have been developed for the ERF for the next edition of the Common Agricultural Policy, maybe to set aside a small fund, a pot of money to try out this way of reducing emissions in the agricultural sector. So that's one thing where we're quite interested. We're quite interested as well in the Australian greenhouse gas accounting for wetlands, blue carbon. This is something which Australia is insisting a lot on internationally, that we are losing a lot of carbon in coastal ecosystems like mangroves, tidal marshes, etc. We don't really have mangroves in the EU, at least in mainland EU, but we have peatlands, wetlands, and that science could be of interest to us in the new edition of our greenhouse gas accounting system. Is it enough?
Yes. Thank you. Questions? Llewellyn and then Jacqueline.
Thanks so much.
And please just introduce yourself quickly, sir.
Sure. So my name is Llewellyn Hughes, and I'm down here from the Crawford School up at the ANU. Thanks. Amazing reforestation program you've got in Europe as well. You'll find I was really interested in your slide about the difference in capital costs as a share of total project costs for renewable projects across the EU member states. You showed a slide earlier.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could describe to us what the conclusions were on what drives that difference. Is that being driven by the different types of financing that exist in different states, that is bank financing versus, going to capital markets, for example, and how the instrument that you described, is specifically kind of designed to deal with those barriers that
it's not up and running. It's a recommendation that we are going to try it. Yeah. Yeah. So there are several explanations to the difference of cost of capital, but we believe that up to 1/3 of the difference of capital is linked to the policy certainty in that particular country with regard to decreasing emissions and renewable support schemes. And a third is already a lot that you can solve by developing an instrument whereby you take away that uncertainty with the policy settings regarding the support schemes for renewables. So that's basically the main issue. Otherwise, in Europe, it's a common tragedy, the fact that it's much cheaper to do things in Germany than in other European member states' economies. That's linked to the health of your economy, of course. But that particular cost differential, 1/3 of it, we believe, comes from the uncertainty related to the energy policy in that particular member state.
Hello, Carolyn, thanks for a fabulous presentation. My name's Jackie Peel. I'm a law academic over at the Melbourne Law School, and I'm doing a lot of work currently on corporate energy transition and looking at these issues around sustainable finance. I'm looking at it mainly in the US, Australian context, but it was really interesting to hear what the EU is doing in this space. I had lots of questions, but I'll try and limit myself to just a few. One is the bigger question around Paris, the Paris Agreement, and what the effect is on the EU of the Trump US withdrawal. The second question is, obviously there's a lot of initiatives going forward in the EU at the moment. What role is civil society playing in either pushing for some of those initiatives in a proactive way or otherwise, in your view? And then just picking up on Llewellyn's question about the different costs of capital, I was just also wondering, I mean, the EU is very different in terms of the capacity of countries and their interest in pursuing a lot of these objectives. Is there a sort of, are there different speeds or different receptivities of countries to some of these things that are being pushed centrally? So that's a lot.
Oh yeah, let's start backwards. Yes, of course. It's no secret that we have some countries that are quite reluctant to be ambitious on the climate front and clean energy front. Poland is one of them. But we have, let's say, we have a mini Paris discussion within the EU, so to say, whereby some are more ambitious and others are allowed to be more lax in their settings. But it's the way we negotiate our common targets. However, the idea that we push is that we push everyone in the same direction. And a good example of that is the way we separate our targets in non-ETS sectors. So that's going to be a bit technical, I try to explain. We can't have specific national targets on ETS sectors because we have one scheme. So we don't know where the emissions reduction will take place. They will take place where it's the cheapest. And so member states can't have an ETS reduction target. However, what they can have and what we have to set up is a specific reduction target for all the non-ETS sectors, basically building, transport, agriculture, whatever else. And the way we do, because we have a one common target at the Paris Agreement in the EU, is that we have to share out the effort on all the non-ETS sectors. And it used to be that in a former share out for 2020, some of our member states were allowed to increase emissions still by 20%, where others were decreasing emissions by 20%. However, we just agreed the new share out for 2020-2030, and the laxer target is 0%. So even our most reluctant member state will have to maintain its emission at zero. The most ambitious target, I think, is 37 something reduction. And so we are doing more than just sharing out at the moment. Next step, we're pushing everybody up. And it's possible because people see it makes economic sense, and because we help with EU funds as well. You had a question about
Society and Trump.
Civil society and Trump. Yeah. I think that honestly, I think that the US withdrawal has only had a mobilizing influence on Europe. Of course, we've heard one or two ministers in one or two countries say we should be careful not to do more than our competitors, but it's really been very subdued and not really been followed. And that has really fired up civil society. And it's quite striking, I think, that you can see that we had tabled targets for renewables and energy efficiency that actually were undershot what society wanted, because both the ministers and the European Parliament are going to agree higher targets than what we had settled. So we actually misjudged the mood when we put forward these targets. I mean, to our credit, the fact is our impact assessment dated from a few years ago, and the price of clean energy is dropping massively. So in fact, it's all becoming cheaper than we thought. And that's also why there's more ambition now. So I really see more push, more ambition from the European civil society in areas that are quite, let's say, not new here, but where people don't seem to be really mobilized here. For example, emissions from ships. It's a big thing in Europe. Plastic waste, 1 ton of recycled plastic, so less virgin plastic, 1 ton of recycled plastic into your stream. That's the equivalent of 1 million cars off roads. Top of that, plastic is an addiction that's very bad for our health. So these type of issues, mobilize people a lot more than I hear it here.
Can I project the technical question to the second part, which is the non-ETS targets? And you said there was a cap of maximum 0% stagnation. Just out of interest, was the Article 372 out of the Doha negotiations, was that coming in as any kind of precedence? Just as a background, Article 372 in the Kyoto negotiations was setting a cap for the second Kyoto Protocol period for countries so that they can't have growth targets anymore, which led to a huge diplomatic explosion with Russia, also with Poland within the EU. But was that coming in?
It was used in our arguments, but it was not the most. I mean, I don't think that was the most convincing. I really think that there was strong pressure from the countries that are doing a lot. Nordic countries are doing a lot in terms of emissions reductions, but the fact is that the abatement cost is higher in these countries as well. And so it doesn't make sense to only have the rich doing the most, because it's cheaper to do most in countries that have the 0% type of target. And so the economic argument also was important here. It was not that expensive to go to 0%. I mean, to maintain 0%.
Thank you. My name's Nick McClellan. I'm a journalist with Islands Business Magazine in the Pacific. Could you tell us how the action plan addresses long-standing concerns raised by least developed countries and small island developing states about access to sustainable financing? For example, on the balance between mitigation and adaptation, on readiness funds to access and prepare the dossiers necessary for this. Because it seems that the current OECD fascination on leveraging private finance is really directed at mitigation programs in large countries. 80%, according to Canfin Grandjean Committee, was to Brazil, China, India. So for LDCs in Africa, for small island states in the Caribbean Pacific, they can't access private funding by and large because there's no return on investment. And their priority for adaptation, it's very hard to get private investors, leverage funds, pension funds and so on to invest in adaptation and community level, which is a core issue for LDCs and SIDS. So I didn't hear it in the action plan. How does it fit in?
Well, it is not part of the exercise. The exercise is how we are going to deliver on our domestic targets in the EU. So it's not about climate finance to the outside world. This being said, we also have...
it's about regulation of the finance industry.
Yes, and smart use of public finance in the EU. So it's not about climate finance to the outside world and developing states. But we have pledged in the European Union to have a 50-50 mitigation adaptation share out of our climate finance in the next edition. If possible, even do more on adaptation, given that the private sector does mitigation more readily. And that's part of our discussion for the next edition of our development funds regulations that we are preparing now. And we know that is the case, and we're trying to skew the balance towards adaptation through our bilateral aid programs. But it is difficult. There's a lot less capacity in developing countries in developing pipeline of projects on adaptation. So that we really have to invest a lot on capacity building in that area. And that's where, that's on what we're focusing right now.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm John Wiseman from the Climate and Energy College and the Sustainable Society Institute. 2 questions. The first is about what can we learn in Australia from the actions taken in the EU to improve the capability, the literacy of boards and asset managers and so on in relation to climate risk and transition risk. So I guess it's partly a question about how successful you think that's been in Europe, but it's also obviously an important and lively discussion in Australia. So that's a question about, you know, what can we learn about that, and what sort of priority actions might we explore in Australia. The second is a question about, there was a dot point on your slides about finance for just transitions for coal regions, which is also a kind of topical issue in Australia. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about, expand on that point really. What again what do you think is impressive in the EU experience in that space, and what could we learn in Australia?
On the just transition, we basically repackaged this for the Macron Summit that was already happening before. As part of our regional funds, we have isolated pilots of 3 coal regions, Poland, Slovakia, and I think 1 in Germany, and 3 industrial regions that also need to change their profile. Don't remember where these was. I remember the coal ones better. And they will be the focus of, they will receive regional funds with the idea of creating using the know-how that's there to create new source of industrial strength and retraining the miners to doing something else. It's very early on. The decision's been taken last year, and so now the programs are being set up. There will be best practice exchanges between these regions in Europe, and Australia is quite interested in what we're doing, and so I have been in contact with the DOE about sharing our experiences there, but I can't say the lessons learned there yet. It's too early. On the on director duties, etc. I think that APRA in Australia has already given the signal that they would do the same as we do, except we tend to regulate. That's just a European way of doing things, whereas in Australia, I understand there's less, let's say people, not less regulation, but it does. If our process is going to be part of director duties, I believe that could have the same strength. It's all about looking at the Australian system and how you can translate the same principles. And one member of the high-level group, Jacob Thoma, came to Melbourne and Canberra just before the Christmas break to present to APRA, to ASIC, to the Treasury Department, to the Banks Association, what we were doing. And he's going to come back this year for further events to promote the discussion about financial sector regulation. It's important for us also because we have the plan of opening trade negotiations, free trade negotiations with Australia, EU-Australia, and the services, and there will be we're the first investor in Australia, and we would like to understand how investments are regulated here.
Are you still okay with taking more questions?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Caroline. My name's Keith Badger. I'm a founding director of the Rescope project. We are focused on systems, engaging both community and systems sustainability. And I'm beginning to dig in. I have a background in the corporate world, into working with companies. And I'm really interested in this space. As we've just said, Australia isn't renowned for having a lot of policies enforced by governments on how the corporate world works. I'm really looking to try and learn what your experience has been with that, but also with engaging public opinion. You've said there is a mood you sense growing in Europe. Certainly I travel a fair bit over there. I'm British, and so I sense it's a very different environment to here. I'm just interested in that engaging the public, and also whether you think companies with their requirement at the end of the day to maximize their shareholders' return on profit, whether they can really engage productively with these issues.
Tough question. I live in Canberra, and that's maybe not representative of the rest of Australia. And so where I live, I see people just as mobilized and as interested as the type of people I would interact with in Europe. But that's very Canberra. Outside, I would say I sense a lot of frustration with politics here, and climate and energy politics, you know, whatever type of people you're talking with. So it's more a sense of, you know, kind of lack of trust in the political system to deliver change. And I think that's what we've been very, let's say, fortunate within the EU, if you can say it now, is that the clean energy and the sustainability sector, they've delivered jobs in the midst of the financial crisis. And so because we went through these tough times, and so that was a source of jobs, and actually we managed to decrease emissions and grow our GDP, we have this, we've managed to show that what economists say is true. You can grow your economy, decrease your emissions, create jobs. And so that takes a lot of the heat out of the political debate. And people realize that. And I think what you probably need in Australia is that demonstration too, be it at state level, that there are false arguments happening there. In terms of the mobilization of people, maybe it's because I spend my time with activists here. I feel that the Australian public is quite mobilized, but it doesn't seem to translate into what politicians do. And I think the last election is an example of that. Yeah, I can't comment too much on Australian politics. And you also mentioned companies. Typically, European companies coalesce into ambition groups, and they call themselves the Ambitious 100, or I don't remember all the names of these private companies groups, and it's a marketing tool as well for them. And basically, European consumers are asking more and more from the products they buy. That's really, really interesting. In Europe, you feel the limits of the planet a lot more in European countries than you feel in Australia. I mean, you more or less have clean air, and I mean, traffic is a problem, but it's not to the level that you can see in the European Union, where the public has to be more engaged, because it's absolutely obvious that this can't continue this way. And as a consumer, there's a lot that you can do in the choices that you make. And so companies are, of course, more worried about what they do. I'll come back to plastics, because it's one of because I can see that plastics is an interesting way to mobilize people. It's basically choking our oceans, it's killing our wildlife, it's threatening our health, it's in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food that we eat. And on top of that, it's a total economic waste, because we are not recycling it. In the European Union, we only recycle 6%. I mean, no, we recycle more than that, but coming back into this production stream is only 6%. So it's about 100 billion euros we're wasting each year in new fossil fuel plastic, virgin. And that's a lot of jobs, and it's a waste of money, and it's threatening our health. So there's absolutely no sense into that, and people can see it. There's a strong push towards banning microbeads, of course, but also single-use plastic, doing more recycling. And now behavioral studies show that once you get people involved about something they can easily do, like recycling, they make the shift towards climate action quicker. It's a question of identity. If you don't see yourself as green, so to say, you feel remote from all these arguments, but suddenly if one tells you, but you're against waste, you're recycling, so that's who you are, and that helps some kind of identity change and makes you more eager to then engage in all sorts of causes. So that's one of the behavioral studies that they found out, that's linked between everyday action, realization that was an environmental aim to that everyday action, and then a broadening of that person's identity to welcome other issues.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I would like to conclude here. For a recorded seminar, there were already a lot of very juicy, substantive comments here. So thank you so much for that very engaging talk. The slides will be on the website, as well as the recording, if you want to go back to all this wealth of numbers. So before we thank Caroline the last time, just a quick advertisement for our next upcoming seminars on the 14th of March now is going to be another finance discussion. Has Australia's investment in the Green Climate Fund been successful, by Sam Johnston here at 11 o'clock, and then Cities and Climate Change by Cynthia Rodenzweig, who's not only on the agricultural impact scene in IPCC, a long-standing member and dinosaur almost in the scientific world, and she's going to present on pathways to urban transformation on the 21st. And then in addition, you're the first to hear about an additional seminar that we slot in on the 20th, Tuesday the 20th, very early morning at 9:30. The Australian ambassador to Germany is going to talk about Australian-German relations in the climate and energy field. That should be interesting. So 20th of March, 9:30, mark it in your calendars. And with that, thank you again for a fascinating talk and for a fascinating Q&A session. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you.